All right, I see 23 people on the call and probably a couple others to join, so I'll just get us started real quick. My name is Herb Smart. I'm going to be your host. I'm a member of the Technical Advisory Committee, and I'm just going to go over a few reminders that you should see here on your screen real quick before I hand things over. You guys are familiar with these, so please don't put the call on hold. Please try and stay on mute unless you wish to speak, and try to unmute yourself when you wish to speak if you want to be heard. And then if this is new, if you've called in on, like, sometimes people call in on like it'll say like iPhone or Samsung Galaxy or something, and you want to rename yourself to your actual name, so it's easier for those of us on the call to see you in the participants list, feel free and do that. You can do that using Zoom. And public comment, of course, is always encouraged. You see listed here, if there's an item not listed on the agenda, you're going to have an opportunity during the public participation item when the chair will call on you. And if you have a comment on items listed on the agenda, there'll also be a comment section specifically after that agenda item. Feel free and raise your hand using the raise hand feature if you wish to speak. We'll do the best we can to check that. And the chat box, the chair also sees that, as does the rest of the participants. And the meeting's being recorded. We're going to post it on turlockgroundwater.org on our YouTube channel as soon as we can after this meeting. And the meeting materials are online at turlockgroundwater.org. The two meeting materials are the agenda and the agenda packet, plus the presentation on groundwater dependent ecosystems you're going to see in a few brief moments. So with that being said, I guess I'll hand over to Michael and or Kevin to take care of the meeting.
All right, we're live. Good afternoon, everybody. It's 2:03 on Thursday, November 5th. Welcome to the Joint Technical Advisory Committee of the West and East Turlock Groundwater Sustainability Agencies. Our first thing is to identify who's here and make sure we have a quorum, particularly for the west side, as we do need 7 members. So let's start with Delhi County Water District. Are you here? Doesn't sound like it. Hilmar? Oh.
Michael, I am present. Sorry.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hilmar? Keys? Denaire? Okay. How about City Modesto?
Miguel Alvarez for City Modesto.
There we go. City of Ceres?
Karen Morgan with City of Ceres.
Good afternoon, Karen. City of Turlock?
Allie Martin, City of Turlock.
Good afternoon, Allie. Turlock Irrigation District. There's a few of us on. Who else is on from TID?
Hi, this is Debbie.
Herb is here.
Good afternoon, guys. Okay, Merced County. Brody, you here?
Yep, you got me here, Michael.
Hey, Brody. And then Stanislaus County.
Ward.
Ward is here. I have that 7 already. Who? If I missed anybody? And if I do, I apologize. All right, so we have a quorum of the West Turlock. Kevin, you want to do a roll call of the East Turlock?
Sure. If Walt just mentioned that he was here, and Brody, he was here. And then I saw Dennis was on the call. Dennis, do you want to announce yourself?
Yeah, Dennis, I'm here.
Okay, so we have a quorum on the east side.
Wonderful. Okay, let's move directly to item number 4, public participation. This is the time set aside for members of the public to directly address the Technical Advisory Committee on any item of interest to the public that's within the subject matter jurisdiction of the Technical Advisory Committee. You can either address us on general items now, or if you have a specific item that's already on the agenda, you are welcome to hold those comments until that item comes up. So at this point, any comments from members of the public on any matter relevant to the subject matter of the Joint Technical Advisory Committee? Herb, have anybody showing hands?
Not seeing anything, Michael.
Okay. So moving on from public participation, we'll go directly to item number 5, groundwater dependent ecosystem evaluation update. This is Karen Morgan of the City of Ceres. Over to you, Karen.
Yes, hi. This is Phyllis Stannon with Todd Groundwater. I'm going to give a really brief introduction to Karen's work today because I thought it would be helpful to pick up where we had left off from before. And I'm going to grab the screen from Herb, and here we go. All righty. Can people?
We got you, Phyllis.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Well, thank you a lot for allowing us to provide you with an update. This is one of the sections of the basin setting that we had not yet quite completed. And so we wanted to give everybody an update on where we were with the evaluation of groundwater dependent ecosystems in support of the Turlock Subbasin GSP. So just as a very brief introduction, I have here 4 little graphics that are taken from one of the guidance documents that has been presented to us by the Nature Conservancy. And this just is going to introduce the concepts that we're going to be talking about a little bit more today. What we're trying to define here are ecosystems that are connected to and supported by groundwater. And you might be able to see in these little graphics from A, B, C, and D, we have a river system here. We have some vegetative communities along the banks of this river. And the groundwater table shown here, which is interactive with the river system. We have a high groundwater level here that's also interacting with the river system, and similarly here as well. And so these 3 areas are where we actually have the ability for some of these natural vegetative communities to be accessing groundwater as a source of water supply. So this concept of connected to and supported by groundwater is what we're looking at for the vegetative communities and wetlands that we're going to be looking at today in the Turlock Subbasin. These examples all involve a river system. Groundwater dependent ecosystems do not necessarily have to involve a river system. You can also have shallow groundwater in the middle of the subbasin, and in fact in some places we do. And but sometimes I think it's just easier to think about the groundwater and surface water interacting when you look at a profile of a river. The one graphic that we have down here that's labeled D is a situation where we have the groundwater table that is too deep for the root zone of the natural vegetative communities to be pulling from groundwater. And you can also see that this is also separated from the river system, in that even though this area beneath the river system is likely saturated from recharge from the surface water down to the groundwater, this is not a situation where we are supporting and providing groundwater supply to the natural vegetative system. So as a result of that, this is called not connected. So this would not be a groundwater dependent ecosystem. So with that little reminder and these diagrams in mind, I'd like to walk through just a couple of introductory slides and then turn this over to the person who has done the real work on this, Karen Morgan. First, I'd like to quickly go through a slide summarizing requirements and the approach that we took for the groundwater dependent ecosystem evaluation in the Turlock Subbasin. And then Karen's going to get into her analysis, beginning with definitions and how GDEs relate to sigma, and then talking about some of her methods and the analysis for analyzing potential groundwater dependent ecosystems. As a reminder, the reason that we're talking about this is because the GSP requires that the Turlock Subbasin GSAs identify groundwater dependent ecosystems within their subbasin. And in particular, regulations say that the GSA should use data available from the department, meaning the Department of Water Resources, or the best available information. And what we're referring to here is a wonderful set of potential GDE mapping data that has been provided to us by the Department of Water Resources. It was put together in conjunction with the Nature Conservancy, California Fish and Wildlife, and many other agencies. And I've represented here just the documentation of the electronic mapping of potential GDEs within the subbasin. This represents this best available information for our subbasin. So these data that have been provided by the Department of Water Resources are the ones that we'll be focusing on today. You can see that it's referred to natural communities commonly associated with groundwater. We've abbreviated that as NCCAG or NCAG, and I'm going to be referring to the NCAG data set, and so will Karen as she moves through her analysis. As a reminder, the NCAG data set wasn't provided until 2018, and at that point, this group had already begun their technical analysis on the GSP. The work plan had been approved, the grant had been funded, and there was no real funding available for analysis of any of these maps. These maps consisted of a lot of separate polygons, more than 2,000 of them, about 2,500 in the subbasin. And you can understand that if without funding and without the ability to actually look at these polygons, either in small groups or individually, that this would just be an incredible lot of work that was completely unfunded and unrealized in our work plan. So we really needed some sort of a reasonable way to put together an approach to get a preliminary assessment so that we could meet the regulation requirements to identify GDEs in the system. And in particular, the Nature Conservancy put out some mass guidance documents. And one of the things that they said is that, you know, you should recognize that all of these 2,500 separate polygons are actually potential GDEs, but they've not been analyzed in detail. There may be some mapping errors. There may be some other things associated with this large map set. And their recommendation was to look at them individually first to eliminate polygons that are unlikely to be GDEs. So that was essentially our approach going into this, was that we were going to be looking at this 2,500 separate polygons, trying our best to group, and in particular, if there was justification, to eliminate some of these polygons for future consideration. Our approach included a sort of multifaceted approach to do a preliminary assessment of the NCAG vegetation and wetland areas, focusing again on this initial elimination of polygons that are unlikely to be GDEs. And these are the types of things that we began to discuss with the GSAs, including areas that had consistently deep groundwater well beyond the root zone, even during high groundwater level time periods, even considering overall fluctuations, so that these were areas that would not likely be GDEs. In addition, the Nature Conservancy developed an online tool called the Pulse tool that took advantage of decades of Landsat information and remote sensing information. And so they have provided this online for the purposes of monitoring any changes to vegetation health over time within your subbasin, and to determine if there's a correlation of the vegetative health to precipitation, or does it rather indicate that it's more likely to be correlated to groundwater. So this Pulse tool was used by Karen in her methodology. And then finally, the GSAs had reviewed before some of these polygons that had been determined to be either artificial or man-made, or at least human-sourced water supply, such as canal spills, man-made ponds, a wastewater treatment plant, irrigation, those types of things that are clearly not natural communities, and therefore, under the definitions of what we were working with, less likely to be GDEs. And so you can see already that there's quite a bit of consideration that needs to be taken into this type of an analysis, and the GSAs didn't have any of this funded. But luckily for the GSAs, one of the member agencies, Karen Morgan, who is the Ceres Public Works Superintendent and a member agency again of the West Turlock Subbasin GSA, has a second life, so to speak, and she has been embarking in graduate work at Oregon State University in natural resources and specializing in water resources management. And so this entire analysis tied in so well with the type of information and data that she had been working with, and was very eager to continue to work with. So lucky for everyone, again, Karen jumped in and took this initial assessment and ran with it on a volunteer basis, I might add, which is no small task. So I am introducing her now, and I would like to also thank her so much for managing this portion of the project. So with that, I'm going to be operating the slides here, and I'd like to turn this over to Karen Morgan. Karen?
Hi, can you all hear me okay?
We can. You sound great.
Okay, so thank you very much, Phyllis, for the introduction. This has been a really exciting project for me, and I really want to thank Liz from Todd Groundwater. Particularly, we've met frequently, once or twice a week, to continue working together, and I think most of the time we were refining maps and trying to figure out the best way to go about this. And Phyllis as well, you've been extremely supportive of me, and it's been a very educational process, and I very much appreciate the opportunity. I'd also like to thank the members of the GSA for trusting me with such a critical study, and I've really enjoyed it. It's been a great experience. As I go through the slides, please feel free to interrupt and ask questions. Between me, Phyllis, and Liz, we can help answer questions and clarify. There's quite a bit of material to cover here, so I'll get going. The first thing is to define what a GDE is. Groundwater dependent ecosystems are poorly understood yet vitally important component of natural habitats for the biodiversity of California. Groundwater dependent ecosystems, GDEs, are plant and animal communities that solely or partially depend on the availability of groundwater to maintain their structure and function. GDEs are specifically defined under California Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, SGMA, as ecological communities or species that depend on groundwater emerging from aquifers or on groundwater occurring near the ground surface. GDEs provide valuable functions that benefit people, such as purifying water, providing recreational opportunities, climate regulation, pollinators for nearby agricultural fields, and habitat for endangered species. Wetlands are unique as well. Wetlands are areas where water covers the soil or is present either at or near the surface of the soil all year or for varying periods of time during the year, including during the growing season. Water saturation largely determined how the soil developed and the types of plants and animal communities living in and on the soil. Wetlands may support both aquatic and terrestrial species. The prolonged presence of water creates conditions that favor the growth of specially adapted plants, hydrophytes, and promote the development of wetland characteristics such as the hydric soil. Wetlands receiving water from groundwater tend to stay wet longer throughout the year than those fed only on surface water. However, when groundwater levels are lowered, the connection to the wetland can be lost, causing water to become unavailable, and these valuable natural habitats may be lost. So here on the next slide, you can see potential dependent ecosystems within the Turlock Subbasin. This is a map of the NCAG polygons. The Department of Drinking Water, DWR, worked with 48 publicly available state and federal data sets that map vegetation, wetlands, springs, and seeps commonly associated with groundwater in California. It was developed through a collaboration between DWR, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the Nature Conservancy. Here in our subbasin, there are 862 wetland polygons and 2,854 vegetative polygons. The number of polygons that we started with represent both sides of the river at this time in the process. we will begin to discuss how we refine the polygons in the future slides to reflect only those polygons that are within the Turlock Subbasin. Also, it's really important to point out that because the presence of vegetation that's typical of a GDE, it does not necessarily indicate that it is a GDE. So next slide, please. To cover the methodology that I use to eliminate the polygons that are unlikely to be GDEs, I'll cover these next 5 steps. The first thing that we did is we converted the polygon format from the NCAG polygons for flexible use in Google Earth. We removed polygons where depth to water was greater than 30 feet in the 2 time periods of the wet year of 1989 and the dry year of 2015. Next, we removed polygons so that they align within the sub-basin boundary. Next, the in-depth assessment of each and every polygon using the Nature Conservancy's Pulse tool, which we'll talk about in future slides. And then finally, the removal of polygons created by man-made features which supply water to vegetation commonly associated with GDEs. These can be examples of surface water, soil moisture in the Valdose zone, applied water, treated wastewater effluent, urban stormwater, and irrigated return flows that were created due to human manipulation of the land. Next slide. So steps 2 and 3 we've combined here. We eliminated polygons where depth to water is greater than 30 feet in both the wet and dry years. This step is to eliminate polygons that were below the rooting depth of plants typically found in GDEs. Groundwater dependent vegetation includes riparian vegetation, wetlands, and purely terrestrial ecosystems like the valley oak woodlands. GDE vegetation relies on the availability of groundwater within the rooting depths of plants. Water uptake can be from within the saturated zone, as well as the capillary fringe, which can extend inches to feet above the water table for sandy and more clayey soils, respectively. An example of a rooting depth is I'm probably going to murder this, Quercus domosa, which is the valley oak, whose roots can grow to an incredible depth of 25 feet in California. And I'll probably murder this one too. The Salix gooding, the Godding's willow, with roots that can reach around 7 feet. These were very common in many of the polygons that I looked at throughout the basin. All polygons that have water levels below 30 feet in the wet year of 1998 and the dry year of 2015 were eliminated. Then the shapefiles were clipped to represent polygons within the basins. Steps 2 and 3 left 1,260 vegetative polygons and 399 wetland polygons for assessment. Next slide. This is an example of a small area along the Tuolumne River before the elimination process described in step 1 and 2. The orange polygons are vegetative and the red polygons are wetlands. So this is just a small area along the Tuolumne River. I zoomed in to try to give a good detail. You can see to the north, it's to the right on this picture, that is outside the Turlock Subbasin. That's actually the Modesto Subbasin. So you can see the vegetation in orange and the wetlands in red. On the next slide, this is far more challenging to see, and I'll explain why. This map shows a small area where the polygons were eliminated after clipping the shapefiles and removing those with depth of water greater than 30 feet. It's really difficult to see the red and the yellow in each polygon because they're simply outlined and they're not filled in like the previous slide. This was a necessary step for the future analysis using the Pulse tool because the Pulse tool can also outline each polygon. It was really helpful for the work that I did so that I could compare apples to apples. I really needed to make sure that I wasn't wasting time analyzing polygons that were removed with depth to water and outside the basin because the Pulse tool still had all of the polygons in and outside the river, actually all over the entire San Joaquin Valley. So this process just really helped me narrow my focus. So after steps 2 and 3, we were left with 1,260 vegetative polygons and 399 polygons. This is a map of the San Joaquin River near the city of Modesto's Jennings facility. As you can see, the boundary is clear with no polygons to the west of the river. You just see along the river, there's red and yellow. Those are the outline polygons that there's several in there. And this is just a small little snapshot of just a small part of the river. Okay, so next slide. Is there any questions so far? Nope, okay. So this is the pulse tool. This is the Nature Conservancy put this out to be used. This was an in-depth analysis that I performed using this pulse tool. It's a visual aid that was designed for water managers and was used to assess every single polygon for the likelihood that the vegetation health and vigor correlates to rainfall. Remotely sensed data can provide a cost-effective alternative to routinely monitor GDE statewide. Remote sensing methods take advantage of different patterns of reflectance related to the level of surface moisture and/or photosynthetic chlorophyll present in vegetation. In the absence of field-based biophysical monitoring data, remotely sensed indices associated with vegetation moisture and chlorophyll can provide an indirect metric of growth and water stress. Both of these variables provide a preliminary proxy to monitor GDE health. Many studies have demonstrated the utility of satellite remote sensing to monitor metrics of vegetation health and vigor and growth, mortality, using different spectral indices. Free and easily available satellite data from the Landsat sensors since 1984 presents a tremendous opportunity to evaluate the long-term trends of change in greenness and moisture content in GDEs over time. Researchers have also found that remotely sensed vegetation metrics, precipitation, and groundwater levels near GDEs are correlated and help better understand the impact of groundwater extraction on GDE health. The GDE Pulse tool provides groundwater managers with critical information to help them better understand the interplay and correlations between GDE vegetation metrics, local precipitation, and groundwater levels. The only downside with the Pulse tool at this time is that Basin valley-wide, only 20% of the polygons showed any correlation with groundwater levels. So at this time, it's not very useful. There's more to come with that, I hear. Using the annual dry month medoids, we calculate the normalized derived vegetation index to estimate vegetation greenness and normalized derived moisture index, NDMI, to estimate vegetation moisture. These vegetation metrics were selected based on their documented relationship to the presence of photosynthetic chlorophyll and moisture, and an ability to provide a proxy for vegetation growth and water stress, which are helpful variables for inferring ecosystem health. Vegetation metrics like NDVI and NDMI could also be affected by local precipitation, so we summarize annual precipitation for each GDE polygon. The Pulse tool allowed me to take a look at each polygon, and the NDVI, which is on the top graph in the center of the slide here, NDMI, which is the lighter blue line, and then precipitation is the very bottom line. This polygon specifically correlates well with precipitation and was marked as unlikely, a GDE dependent on groundwater. So you could see the purple arrow is pointing to the outline of the GDE, of the polygon, and the graphs in the center were very, very helpful. You could see a thin gray line down the very center, and that is a trend line that you can slide back and forth across all of the lines for NDVI, NDMI, and precipitation. So I selected a 5-year segment. You can narrow it down to 5 years or expand it for the whole length of time. And as I'm looking at each polygon, I slowly moved that trend line across the graphs, and you could really tell if they're closely related or not because the trend lines line up perfectly with each other. And you can see here just at a glance that each line correlates with each other. So this is how I decided whether or not I felt like it was dependent on groundwater or dependent on rainfall, and whether it was either likely a GDE or unlikely a GDE. So the next slide, you'll see quite the opposite.
Can you say there, stop there, Karen?
Sure.
Just to make sure I'm looking at the right data. So on the precipitation, the trend during that gray period is trending down while the NDMI and the NDVI are fairly flat. That's the difference?
Yes, but as you slide it around, you'll see that this slide has much more correlation with precipitation than it doesn't. So in some of them where it was really only in line with the precipitation about half of the time, I marked those as unknown because I could not make a judgment call either way. So where I stopped with this graph may not be the best place. I could have stopped at another spot where they both shot up at the same time or shot down at the same time. I really just wanted to be able to show that you can move this graph back and forth.
Okay.
And you can play around with this. It's very easy to find if you just type in the Nature Conservancy Pulse tool. It's very user-friendly. So let's see. On this process, yes, there you go. On this slide, the process was the same. I carefully compared the trend line using the sliding 5-year scale. This polygon was marked as likely a GDE since it does not correlate with precipitation like the other one did. You can see there's quite a difference. It's also important to note that some of the polygons where it was too difficult or there was a lack of evidence to eliminate, to be conservative, these polygons were identified as unknown and remain GDEs for further studies, and we'll discuss this in future slides. So a visual assessment was also done. That was step 5. During the process of me looking at every one of these GDEs, I made notes on the Excel spreadsheet that I was using, and just to be able to go back in the future. So it's clear that this is probably a dairy farm, and that big red square is a wetland that has vegetation commonly associated with a GDE. But again, these are not, they don't qualify as GDEs in Sigma. So this is one that was marked to be removed because it was associated with a man-made structure. So my visual assessment was done during the process of determining the correlation of precipitation. Polygons that are connected to human-related structures and do not qualify as GDEs. Many of these polygons were eliminated in the previous steps, such as the water level assessment, but some remained, such as this wetland polygon here. I was able to visually remove 16 vegetative polygons and 9 wetland polygons during this process. More polygons have notes for evaluation, and we'll discuss this soon. Next slide. So this is really the end of my assessment. These are the remaining polygons within the Turlock Subbasin. There's 1,108 currently retained polygons. Most of these are along river boundaries, which are likely dependent on groundwater at least some of the time. Next slide. And just to show you a little bit clearer, the remaining polygons for the vegetation, there's 718 in yellow here. And the next slide. You can see the wetlands here in red. There's 390 that are retained as potential GDEs. And so with that, I would like to hand it right back over to Phyllis. You're on mute, Phyllis.
There we go. Thanks so much, Karen. And then on this last slide that Karen has as well, this just sort of summarizes some of the future work that we're going to have Karen help us with to just clean up some things. As she had mentioned previously, she's got some notes made throughout this entire data set. By the way, the data set is a wonderful opportunity for building for the future to continue to identify key areas that can be monitored and managed going forward. But there are some of those polygons that have already been, again, related to man-made features that Karen would be continuing to analyze. And then we also talked about the possibility of Karen actually visiting some of the GDEs that we think could be sourced by surface water only. You might recall that we had eliminated so many of the I'm going to call them inland, away from the river boundaries within the subbasin itself. And so there's a reasonable number there that we could just quickly do a visual on. It's not so clear sometimes from the Google Earth or the other air photo images that we've been using, and sometimes it helps to actually see something on the ground. So there's the opportunity in the future to do a little bit more detail with respect to ground truthing. We've also had potential opportunities to work with TID. TID made an early offer that perhaps going forward, if there were some GDEs available that had been identified within the TID, that they have field people that are often involved, and also they have biologists that do a lot of work along the Tuolumne River. And so there's the opportunity to perhaps pull on some of their resources in the future for some of this work as well. And just as an example, Karen had pulled this together, and I liked it so much just to show it. There are these areas that are clearly man-made areas, but then they also support vegetation at this point. And so I think that there's some question about whether or not these are actually GDEs with respect to Sigma. And one of those areas, it's actually a very large area along the Merced River in the sort of eastern portion of the subbasin, where we have a tremendous volume of dredge tailings. People may have seen these just driving along the river. This is from near Snelling. The community of Snelling is shown here. And as everyone knows probably, that there's been a lot of historical gold mining operations along the rivers of California, and in this area in particular, we have historical dredge tailings remaining. And what we see in these dredge tailings is that in areas after the dredge works sort of a section and moves to the next section, there are little mounds and valleys, sort of ridges and valleys within the dredge tailings themselves. And those valley areas clearly funnel and collect a lot of runoff. And as a result of that, you get a lot of vegetation that are lined up. And I think if you look away from some of the polygons, you can see these little lines of vegetation that are associated with these. And so they didn't quite meet our criteria for depth to water, and they didn't quite meet our criteria for the pulse tool. So they are currently left in, but Karen has flagged them certainly as being associated with man-made features. So that's, yes.
Question. Just using this picture as an example, about how many polygons am I looking at? Maybe Karen knows.
Have any idea? I don't.
A lot. There's probably anywhere between 75 to 125 in the whole Snelling area at least.
Okay.
Some of these are all connected, and then some of them there's just little tiny ones. There was some information when they were creating the polygons. They had to meet a minimum size, and then they used the vegetation that dominated the polygon to give it, whether it's a willow, a oak, or and other species, if that makes sense.
And Karen didn't mention everything that she had done, but I just wanted to also give her kudos on additional work on the pulse tool that we didn't really talk about in this presentation. But there's also the opportunity to just look at distressed areas over time. and to just, it gives you the opportunity on the pulse to just slide through time with various areas. So she's done, she talked a lot about the detailed correlations that she did with the NDVI and NDMI, but there's also some overall sort of basin reconnaissance work on that she did as well, and trying to determine whether or not we saw really distressed communities associated with this recent drought of record, and really couldn't find anything in particular on that. So I thought that was an interesting point and good news with respect to what she had done there.
Phyllis?
Just
Karen?
one other thing really quick. With using the pools tool, one thing that I discovered towards the end, I knew that I was going to be missing some of the polygons, because when you have one area where it's all connected, but there's 20 polygons in that area, the outlining was really nice. But when I got to the very end and I was like, yay, I've looked at all of them. I've come all the way up to the end of Snelling. This is amazing. I still had about 150 polygons that weren't looked at. And I did discover that in the pools tool, you can search a polygon. So if we're looking at the spreadsheet and somebody says, okay, well, this one says it's associated with ag. Well, where is this? You can take that ID number and plug it into the pools tool, and it takes you right there. So that was very exciting for me. So all of the ones that I marked can actually be re-looked at with, a different set of eyes and a different judgment.
And again, I'll just say kudos quickly to Karen for the data set, because I think that is such a valuable thing that we have going for the future. Yes, please. Questions for Karen?
Yes, Karen or Phyllis. This is Milt Treeweiler, Turlock citizen. I obviously have a different frame of looking at this. I was born here in Turlock in 75 years ago. And I remember when what may have been referred to at that time as groundwater dependent ecosystems are no longer in existence. And again, I would be referring to what you call the inland areas, but as agriculture took over these areas and the well pumping started, these what could have been or were groundwater dependent ecosystems are now no longer in existence. So what is the time frame that we're tying ourselves to here? In other words, we're not going back to 1945 or 1955. I know you gave a timeline, but what was that again?
So these that we looked at were from 1986 to 1990. What did I say, Phyllis? Now I can't remember.
I think it went through 2018.
2018.
Yeah, 2018. I remember that.
One interesting thing when I was reading about the Central Valley and some of the other work that I've done when I was working on my bachelor's degree in the Central Valley, and in reading the Nature Conservancy's documents that were prepared for this, only 90% of the GDEs remain in the entire San Joaquin Valley due to the way we manage water today. So for Sigma purposes, we're only looking back to 2015. Is that right, Phyllis?
So 2015 is the end of our historical period, and we have looked backwards to 1991. But essentially, the polygons that we see are current conditions, and we're just trying to make sure that as we move through the GSP process, we don't have management actions or projects that inadvertently cause areas to be lost or adversely impacted. And I think just knowing sort of where they are and paying attention with respect to the process is a key portion of that.
Yeah, and I know this is kind of irrelevant to this discussion, but I remember swamplands all over the valley. I mean, full of blackbirds, full of tules, and they were all over the valley in the inland areas. But I know that's gone, that's history, it's past. Okay, I'll be quiet. Go ahead.
Well, we see that all over the Central Valley and all over California. I remember I've done a lot of work in Kern County, and there were some older 1902, 1903 papers that were put out by the federal government that said, we're not sure what we're going to do with this area because no one's ever going to be able to live here. And this was in the Bakersfield area. They were saying it's just way too swampy, and there's too much flooding, and there's too many problems, and there's a lot of mosquitoes, and this is completely and totally inhabitable land. And that was the city of Bakersfield. So yeah, it certainly has changed. There's no question about it. And what we want to do now, of course, is focus on where we have diverse communities and be aware of them, because I think that in some ways, and I think that the GSP regulations really got it right. The main thing to do here is to identify and map them. And that gives you the first opportunity to know what you're doing and know what you're affecting.
Hey, Phyllis and Karen, I have a question.
Good.
Can you guys hear me?
We can.
We can.
You can?
Yes.
Okay, this is Walt. I can understand the wetlands and the different ecosystems along the San Joaquin, recognizing that historically that's been known as a groundwater discharge area. And we know that accretions are picked up in the San Joaquin, and it's not all surface water flows. But I'm wondering, along the Tuolumne, is there a different line of approach here where what makes these groundwater dependent is what's kind of my question. And how, when we looked at the river flux, the boundaries between the basins, and we talked about gaining and losing reaches and all that, is there a line of evidence that supports or counters or lends a little more depth of discussion to this whole notion that just because these types of ecosystems are mapped along the river boundaries may not have anything at all to do with groundwater? It might be surface depression, it might be soils, it might be topography, it might be man-made disturbance. I mean, a whole lot of things that just in and of themselves, just because they're there, doesn't make them groundwater dependent. So I just kind of bothered by this. I'm not quite sure what we do with it or where we're ever going to go with it. When I used to work in South Florida, as you guys can all imagine, you know, the Everglades and all those different wetland ecosystems were everywhere. And when we looked at groundwater withdrawals, potential impacts and potential for harm to wetlands, and we didn't call them GDEs, but wetland ecosystems, you know, once we were able to map them out by soil, by hydro period, by vegetation, you know, by indicator species, there's a number of factors. Then the whole problem became, well, what's an impact? What's a harm? And it becomes this detailed discussion that goes into timing and magnitude and duration, and it gets really, really complicated. So before we get ourselves backed into a corner and we present the world and say, yep, we got all these GDEs in our basin, I think we need to be more careful and selective. And so
I don't disagree with that at all. And in fact, I want to point out a few things that we already did on purpose along those same lines. So thing number one, Karen's entire initial assessment here was to look at relatively straightforward conditions that could eliminate some of the polygons. This is not a confirmation process. It has been an elimination screening process. So she is not saying that the remaining polygons, the 1,108 or so that she has remaining, she's not saying that those are GDEs. And you can see that we were careful on our slides because that is not the analysis. We said on our slides that they are potential GDEs. They came to us as potential GDEs and they remain potential GDEs because we didn't, again, confirm them. We rather eliminated. So I think that this was a very reasonable and necessary first step to get this number down to a place that was a little more manageable, a little more understandable, something a little more that we could work with. So that was an important first step. The next step that we have going forward is that as we see areas where water levels might be drawn down in certain areas, we can begin to better understand and evaluate how those lower water levels might impact GDEs in that area. We're not saying all of them are GDEs. We're not saying they're not. We're just simply saying what's going to happen in certain areas. Now, under SGMA, we are required to look at interconnected surface water. That's a sustainable management criteria whereby we're actually going to be looking at whether or not projects deplete surface water supply. And so all of these remaining GDEs that we have seen are generally related around the river. And I catch myself again, the potential GDEs are primarily around the river. So we'll be able to evaluate the interconnected surface water changes associated with our projects and our management actions, and we will see, how we fare going forward there. But at this point, the requirements of the GSP are to better understand and in fact identify. So that was our real charge, is to begin to identify. And what we feel like that we have done is by eliminating some that were obviously not GDEs, we have identified the potential GDEs. And so the Subbasin now has an excellent data set to move forward with. And I'm just going to go ahead along the same line, Walt, if you'll give me just one more second here and just skip to my last slide, because there are a couple things here that I want to mention that I think relate to what you're talking about. So our next steps in this process is for Karen to finish up her initial assessment and incorporate a description of her methods and analysis into our GSP basin setting section as required by the GSP regulations. And then we have her nice data set and information on the retained polygons, which will be our going forward, our potential GDEs. And we can begin to look at where changes in our subbasin are predicted as a result of management actions and projects and how that might impact polygons that are in the area. And in particular, one of the things that the Nature Conservancy suggests right off the bat is that you go through the polygons and identify habitats and species that have a statewide or federal or local importance. And some of that will come out of our programmatic EIR analysis. And as you know, we now have a round 3 grant to do a PEIR for our GSP projects and management actions. So we will be able to provide Karen's work to our EIR subconsultant and sort of work with them to move forward on environmental impacts. So, that didn't answer your question of where are they really, but rather I'm trying to just sort of frame how we looked at this analysis. We see this as a screening, and that's essentially what's required to come up to identify. And then the last thing I'll say before I turn it back over to questions is that Karen's work removed more than half, depending on how you begin to count up these little polygons, up to 2/3. And so this moved us importantly, I think, as a subbasin from having this, massive amount of information that we just really didn't know exactly what to do with, and how could we get our arms around it. It moved us from, something that was just completely unknowable to something that feels a little more manageable. And so I think that's where the real value and importance of her work lies with this project.
And if I can just chime in here really quickly, in the removal or elimination process, in the data set, nothing was deleted. It was simply marked with an X. Was this correlating with rainfall? Was it not correlating with rainfall? Does this GDE seem like it might be associated with agriculture? And then other notes where it says on the edge of a pond, possibly within a man-made structure. It was really just, I don't want to say quick because it wasn't quick. I've been working on this since June. But it was really just a process of just giving a little bit more information for each polygon.
And I'd like to chime in here. This is Liz with Tot Groundwater. First of all, before I say what I was going to say, I just wanted to say thanks so much to Karen. She has been working tirelessly the last few months on this, and boggles my mind how much she has done. But I just also, coming back to your question, Walt, just want to point out that we tried to be conservative, like Phyllis said. We have seen in other GSPs that were done for the critically overdrafted subbasins, some comments coming back from DWR criticizing their methodology for removal of potential GDE polygons as being kind of too liberal. Like, what's the scientific basis for removing all of these? And so kind of some pushback. So we wanted to be really conservative, and I think our depth to water analysis was a conservative approach. We set the kind of the threshold at a depth to water of 30 feet, which is following, the best management practices, which are based on, the maximum rooting depths being, 25 to 30 feet. But that doesn't mean that all of the rooting depths for all of the plants that we're calling potential GDEs are that deep. There are lots of plants, like Karen mentioned earlier, where the rooting depth may be, 7 to 10 to 15 feet. So in areas where depth to water is, say, 25 to 30 feet, those plants may not be GDEs because their roots stop above the groundwater table and don't rely on groundwater for their supply. But for this analysis, it was impossible for us to do that, to go through every single plant and compare rooting depth, which we don't know in a lot of cases, to the depth to water. So in the end, this map that we came up with, as Phyllis said, are potential GDEs based on kind of a conservative approach.
All right. Do you have more questions for Karen or Phyllis or Liz at this time? Just want to thank you, Karen, for your hard work and dedication over the last 4 or 5 months going through this elimination and screening process. It looks like at this stage, almost for the purpose of the GSP, do we have enough information, or can we meet the minimum requirements in the legislation for answering the questions on GDE and the GSP, Phyllis, or is there a lot of work to do, a little bit of work to do? I mean, you mentioned next steps. I just want to be sure we are in the right spot.
I think so. I mean, I think that Karen's work satisfies the requirements to go through the NCAG data available to us and eliminate those that are clearly not likely GDEs and allow the rest to remain. And that is the requirement for the GSP, is that we identify potential GDEs. And I think that this step gets us to where we need to be with that. There's going to be a lot of future work on a lot of various portions of the GSP process going forward. It's a plan. It's not the final word.
Right.
And as a result of that, there will be more information that we will gather as we go, and we will begin to better understand what we need to know and focus our efforts on those things. And I think that's an appropriate way to go. And then there's also the ability to continue to monitor, which we obviously will do with respect to our river systems anyway.
Okay, fantastic. So
Hi,
great.
this is Debbie.
Hey, Debbie.
Sorry. I just wanted to thank Karen and Phyllis and Liz for all their work on this. And I had suggested that perhaps there are some other, maybe some field crews that might be able to help follow up on a few things, because I did notice that there are a few polygons still remaining in the western side of the subbasin, not adjacent to the river, and we might want to take a look at those, perhaps. So I'll reach out to our field staff and see what their thoughts are, and maybe I can connect them to you, and how best to move towards at least looking at that. It could be that they're connected to, those are perhaps drains or other things that are related to field runoff, or I just don't know. And so looking into that might be helpful.
That would be very helpful, Debbie. I appreciate. I felt bad taking advantage of your offer by putting that on a slide, and I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I knew that you had offered this before, and you've got a lot of resources in the field, and appreciate the offer, and we're going to take you up on that.
In studying how to go about doing this process, there were some really interesting ideas that other scientists were using. But just to step back a little bit, there's very little research and any available knowledge. It's very minimal on GDEs. It's like it's never been studied. So it's really kind of groundbreaking stuff in a lot of ways. So it's really interesting to me anyway. Some of them include taking temperature measurements within the water using like infrared lighting, so that you can literally see, and I saw some videos of it, of warmer plumes of water seeping out of the ground, and it just looks like clouds of a red contaminant and a little bit of yellow, and it was like, wow, you can really see the groundwater on a cold winter day coming out of the ground. So there's just some really interesting stuff that's going to be coming up with this stuff. So in the future, there's definitely some opportunities, short of the Turlock Subbasin putting a satellite up in space to study our ecosystems.
My day, Karen, and I just echo other people and just thanking you and all of your hard work on this. I wasn't clear how much field work you ended up doing. Was this pretty much like a looking down type thing?
There was no actual site visits involved. That is definitely one of the next steps that Phyllis had kind of mentioned. And I think Phyllis was going to talk about, who's going to be doing those next steps, and is it going to be after the GSP is developed with the PEIR? There's maybe a few places, but there's more work that could be done for sure. But some of the site visits would be pretty easy.
I share some of the concerns Walt has, and I think Debbie was talking about. I know from looking in the Modesto Basin, we have some of the same thing. We're just talking to some of the growers that are monitoring that whole thing, that they're looking at the GDE maps and going, oh yeah, that's a tailwater return system. That's a ditch that we run. That's a wildlife preserve that we managed for wildlife.
Right.
They're just kind of going clicking through it, and that's just having some on the ground knowledge. And why protect stuff that we don't need to? Now I have another question, which is, are there particular species of trees that we're trying to protect, and are cottonwoods one of them?
Cottonwoods were in the data set that I have. Kind of like I said, each polygon has a species that was had a larger distribution. So that's what that polygon is for. So there was oaks, willows, cottonwoods, freshwater marsh, There was quite a few. So every single polygon in the data set that we have lists what the dominant species is for that polygon. Does that answer your question?
With respect to what we would like to protect, that's going to be an ongoing decision by the GSAs. And I think, again, I'll just emphasize that until you know what you've got, that's an awfully hard thing to decide, right? So that's really the value of this work, is to already identify what we've got. And then again, when it comes to the species of statewide importance that are going to be identified, you know, Karen, Liz, and I none of us are biologists, and we recognize that expertise. And we also recognize that that expertise is going to be, number one, available in our Turlock Subbasin very shortly, and number two, begin to be analyzed by the PEIR work. And so again, we thought that this was a wonderful opportunity to get this done in advance of the PEIR and begin to use their resources and their understanding and their knowledge with respect to identification of anything that has, you know, perhaps federal status or other kinds of statewide importance. I'll just keep using the phrase that TNC uses for this subbasin. And so the answer is that we don't know that quite yet, but we see that there is expertise coming into this subbasin already envisioned, and we're going to take advantage of that.
There are some maps available for protected places such as habitat conservation plans. I did review some of those maps. I didn't quite get it to include that here, but I'd be willing to share those with Phyllis and maybe include them in our write-up. But what I did see is that they're mostly to the east and just protecting grasslands. They weren't in the river channel that I could tell. So if there's a certain species, you know, a nice little flower that grows underneath the oak trees that are just really rare, those were not included in the polygon. It just went for the dominant species. So in that sense, it was kind of odd to me to not include endangered species in the polygon. But this is just a first wave of analysis.
And an important one that was able to eliminate a tremendous amount from what we want to be able to better understand. So, any other questions?
Kevin
Hey,
has a
Karen. Oh, Kevin, you want to go ahead?
No, you go ahead, Brody.
Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Karen. This is a really great work. Just wanted to kind of confirm. So it sounds like in the Snelling area, that's obviously of particular interest to us since that's mostly County White area in Merced. So it sounds like there's going to be some changes to those polygons there. I'd just be curious to kind of understand what that change in analysis is going to look like, if it's going to eliminate most of those polygons, and kind of just moving forward. I guess that's an area where I'd want a little more information on moving forward.
So when I originally did the analysis looking for the correlation with precipitation, looking at those polygons around all the mine tailings, I had no idea what that was. I thought it was disked fields. So at the time, I couldn't tell what came first. Was it the odd shapes on the ground or the trees? So Phyllis, when she looked at it, when we were talking about this, knew exactly what they were. And then the discussion came up, okay, so the mining happened first, and that land change provided the right circumstances for a groundwater dependent ecosystem to flourish. So now the question is that a GDE or not under Sigma? So that's kind of difficult because there's not an additional water source from an unnatural source. So it's kind of challenging. Those are the questions that I have marked where we need somebody to help out a little bit and make those decisions with us, not just me.
Hi, I'd like to chime in. This is Liz again. And just, you know, one thing that we were grappling with the man-made structures is like that pond that Karen pointed out that was associated with the dairy. If that dairy stops operating, then that pond will go away, right? So that's clearly man-made and it's not a GDE. But in the case of the dredge tailings, that's a permanent deformation of the land surface. So that is going to be like that forever, probably, or however long you want to say. But it's now, you know, a current natural condition and won't change. And so if there's a GDE that's growing in the trough of one of those tailings, and groundwater levels are lowered in the future, and that plant is no longer able to draw on the groundwater to survive, then it may die. And so it seems like we kept going back and forth. And I think we were being conservative and thinking that we don't have like a sound reason to eliminate that as not a potential GDE at this point. So at this point, we're not really sure if we're comfortable removing those GDE polygons that are within the dredge tailings.
And something to point out too, the image that you saw of those mine tailings, that is not after my analysis. That is what I used for the analysis. So we would need to zoom in on the map after the elimination process to see what's left. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. Thanks.
Because, yeah, some were removed.
And my question was related to that same area. I think you said there were anywhere between 75 and 100 remaining in that area, which is about 10% of your total potential GDEs in the Turlock Basin. So,
well, let me correct you. In that image itself, there may have been about 75. What has been removed out of that specific area, I don't know.
Oh, you started with about 75.
That's about how many were in the whole Snelling area. I would have to look again. I mean, there was quite a few.
Okay. So still you're 8% of the entire total. So it gives me comfort to know that most of those can probably be eliminated because of, as Phyllis will probably know, and Liz, tailing areas near rivers tend to be river dependent, not groundwater dependent. So I think when we do go out there and take a physical look at them, I think you're going to be able to eliminate most, if not all of them. But that's just my feeling from having been up there myself. So and seen other tailing sites on the Calaveras and the Stanislaus River. So just more information. I like the idea of letting the PER take care of additional work. I don't think the GSP needs to get into this in any more detail. If anybody criticizes this work, they're just looking for trouble from the rest of us, I think. Nice work, Karen.
Thank you.
Okay, again, great work, Karen. Thank you very much. And thanks, Liz and Phyllis, for the support. Okay, moving on to the next item, number 6, Sigma related updates. There's an opportunity for TAC members to discuss and provide updates on issues related to Sigma. Obviously, no action is taken. Do we have anything heard from the public outreach group?
Just a couple things, Michael. First, the biggest item is that we are going to have a groundwater lunch hour, an open-ended, just kind of available for stakeholders or conversation lunch hour on November 13th. And I have a flyer for that that I could probably pull up as I talk here. But it's going to be, as I butcher my screen here, it's going to be November 13th, 12:30 to 1:30. Oh, there we go. 12:30 to 1:30, and it's basically, just we're going to try and do one of these every 2 to 4 weeks. And it's just kind of an open line during the lunch hour to have conversations with people. It'll be via Zoom. They could join by way of link. They can call the number on the screen. It's plastered all over the Turlock Groundwater .org website. And it's just kind of another way to check in between formal workshops that we've been having with stakeholders. And so you'll start to see more on that. We're putting it out on our Twitter feed, our Facebook feed, and on our sending emails to our interested party list, which is around 320 at this point in time, 320 stakeholders. So that's going on. I'll mention that. As much as I can for the next week and a half. And then also we have a stakeholder survey that I've mentioned before in the past. That is still ongoing. Encourage people to go online onto our website and to check that out. And then we're looking forward to our next virtual community workshop. We haven't planned a date yet. We're looking to let a few things that are going on with the technical team come a little bit further or to fruition, and then maybe sometime in the January timeframe, we'll get to talking about the next things on the list. So that's my brief update, but the big thing is Groundwater Lunch Hour, November 13th, from 12:30 to 1:30, and it's open the whole time. It's an open house style format. For this first one, we're just going to have members from the ad hoc communications committee be available for conversation, and people can check in or out as they need to. And so then in the future, if we continue to hold them, it'd be nice to kind of develop some sort of rotation amongst TAC members where we could have 2 or 3 people on with Megan Wiley, who leads up our is the sub-consultant for Todd Groundwater. Groundwater's team. She works for Sac State's participation or their outreach kind of center they have there for facilitation, and she kind of leads everything up and runs the Zoom and everything. So it'd be nice to kind of have a rotation in the future. But for this one, I'm assuming it's Kevin, myself, and then Megan answering questions and putting people in the right direction. And if there's no questions, if no one jumps on, we could do a little bit of work that our ad hoc committee typically does during the week. So that could be done too. So just November 13th, Groundwater Lunch Hour, 12:30 to 1:30. Information's online at turlockgroundwater.org. But that's it from me.
Thank you, Herb. That's a great idea to do that. Any questions for Herb?
Yeah, Kevin, just adding into what Herb said, anybody's welcome to call into that lunch hour and listen or participate. So don't feel like you're excluded.
And one quick thing too that makes me think of, the flyer is available, and I could send it around too after this call to the TAC, or have someone send it around through the proper channels. But feel free and forward that to your individual agency customers, or put it on your newsletters, and just try to get as many people as possible. It's kind of a new thing. We may get 1 person, we may get 10 people, who knows? And members of the TAC could certainly call in as well if needed. It's not necessarily something that they have to do or even really should do unless they're interested. It's more for trying to get stakeholders kind of to discuss things. So yeah, thanks for the time.
Sounds good. So we have a grant update from Debbie. And Debbie's not in the FBI Witness Protection Program. She has not changed her name to be anonymous. Congratulations, Debbie. You want to share your good news?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. So I was married about a week and a half ago or so. So my new last name is Montalbano. So if you see it, you'll know who you're talking to.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Congratulations.
The grant, thank you. So the grant update, I just have a few things. as you all know, we have developed an ad hoc committee or work group for the GRAT, the Groundwater Recharge Assessment Tool that's being developed through the Prop 68 round 3 grant that we received through DWR. And so we had our first work group meeting last week, and we plan to have work group meetings about weekly to kind of work through the process and tackle items as we go, and we'll be reporting back to the TAC at its regular meetings to kind of bring everybody else along, and we'll be reaching out either the GRAT work group or the technical assistants or consultants that we're working with to develop the GRAT with respect to the needs for data or what have you. But a lot of the data and information, I think, will come from the work group participants. We've got representatives from TID as well as the cities, and then we have representatives from both, I think, the county, Merced County, and Eastside Water District for the eastern portion of the Subbasin. And so there's pretty broad representation, but we'll need to reach out to others, you know, as we move through this process. So please be aware. We have also retained ESA as a consultant for the PEIR that was discussed earlier. And Todd Groundwater and I had just a preliminary project discussion with her earlier this week. And Meredith Parkin is the staff member at ESA who we'll be working with. And so we are going to be developing a proposal on how to move that process forward and bringing that back to this group to talk about at a future TAC meeting. But I wanted to let you know that kind of we're working through that, and stay tuned. Oh, and on the GRAT, I wanted to follow back up and ask if Valerie could give maybe an update on, there's an agreement with Sustainable Conservation and Earth Genome and the consultants who are developing the GRAT that we'll need to consider for the use of the GRAT moving forward. And so Valerie is working on that agreement as well as a non-disclosure agreement regarding the data sets that would be available as well and used for developing that. Valerie, could you maybe give an update on those?
Sure, yep. So there's the GRAT license, and that's obviously protecting the IP and making sure that we don't take any of the developed platform and kind of run away with it. We have gone back and forth a little bit with Sustainable Conservation because we want to make sure that the GSAs can control and own the data that's coming out of the GRAT. So that's kind of a typical sticking point or typical issue with these kinds of licenses and contracts when you have a consultant doing work. I think so far that that's going well, and we'll get language. We've gone back and forth with language once or twice, but I think we're pretty close. And so then that would be the GRAT license that the West Turlock, as the grantee and the person hiring Sustainable Conservation, would sign. Once we have that finalized, we would bring it to the West Turlock board. If folks are interested in seeing the final language at the TAC, we can do that. The other document is, as we started thinking more about the GRAT and the data that would be provided, we wanted to make sure that it was that people providing data, that the disclosure to use it in the GRAT didn't create other exposures or disclosures or make it public data when it's not. There are some members of both the GSAs and the GSAs themselves that have the need to protect confidential data. So we are, I have drafted a non-disclosure and confidentiality agreement. We made it fairly broad, and any GSA and any member of the GSAs can sign it if you want your data that you provide to the GRAT protected. A draft of that is going to be the West Turlock board this evening, but we do have to share it with the other partners. We had one meeting with them, and I think that should go fine. And I don't think that any of the terms will be objectionable. So that's the status on that. If anyone wants their counsel to look at that, we certainly have a copy of it, and we can circulate it as needed.
Thank you, Valerie. Any
Sure.
questions with respect to that?
Okay, any other?
Okay.
Sorry, Debbie. Any other
Nope.
updates?
That was about it. We're also working on identifying potential well locations, and then I'll work with Todd Groundwater on which ones might work for the West Turlock GSA monitoring wells that are also funded through the Round 3 grant. As I understand it, the East Turlock has already identified their locations, and Valerie is working with Lauren on access agreements, and so we'll have more information on that at the next meeting as well.
Okay, sounds good. Anybody else in the group have an update they want to share? Okay, sounds nice. As Valerie mentioned, tonight at 5 o'clock is the West Turlock Subbasin GSA board meeting. So you'll find the agenda on Turlock Groundwater, log in, and obviously everyone's welcome to attend. It's a public meeting. So 5 o'clock tonight. And then the next special meeting of the Joint Technical Advisory Committee is scheduled for Thursday, November 19th. So we'll see you all then, if not before. Any other questions? We adjourn. Okay, with that, I'll take a motion for adjournment from the West Turlock Subbasin.
Karen with the City of Ceres will motion to adjourn. Thank you.
We have a second.
Curtis will second.
Okay,
Thank you, Curtis.
Thank you, Curtis. A courtesy from Curtis. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, we are adjourned. Kevin?
Thank you, Michael. Good meeting today. Dennis, did I hear you?
Yes, I will move to adjourn.
I thought that was you. And Walt, will you second, please?
Yeah, second.
Okay, East Side's adjourned. Thank you all.
Okay, thanks everybody.